Hello again. Almost 200 years ago, an obscure French writer coined a phrase which might be roughly translated as the more things change, the more they stay the same. I was reminded of this the other day when I came across a paperback thriller in a charity shop which had been published in the 1970s. It was called The Rage and the author was Jack Ramsay. The cover declares that this is the chilling rabies novel which could become tomorrow's terrifying headlines. A rabies novel. They describe it so because there were quite a spate of them at that time and they formed something of a subgenre of dystopian fiction. The thumbnail to this video shows the cover of the book. It tells the horrifying story of an unstoppable epidemic of rabies which spread from Britain to Britain from France. There were a few science fiction novels and thrillers published on this theme in the late 1970s. Rage was published in 1978 and the previous year had seen another thriller called Saliva hit the bookshops on a similar theme. Another popular thriller on the subject was called The Day of the Mad Dogs. Novels like this were very popular because throughout the 1970s the fear of a terrible outbreak of rabies was very much on people's minds. Just as we were led to see a panic about AIDS and more recently the COVID hysteria, so in the 1970s was rabies the terrible plague which would soon engulf Britain. In retrospect, of course, it seems quite mad that people should have been so worked up about this virtually non-existent threat. But to be fair, the government was winding everybody up about the supposed danger, just as they did with AIDS and precisely as has also been done over the last couple of years with COVID. What we might call the rabies panic really began in 1969, when a dog in Surrey died of rabies. It had been brought back, it had come out of quarantine too quickly, it had picked up rabies abroad. Because it had been for walks before it died of rabies, it was thought that it might have spread rabies to some other helpless animal. And so great was the fear of an epidemic of rabies that the army was called in. And not only the army, every wild animal within a 2-mile radius was either shot or gassed. Cyanide was pumped into rabbit warrens and every man with a shotgun was summoned to join the hunt, killing squirrels, rats, foxes and any other mammal that was seen. The fear then grew that pets were being smuggled back into Britain without being held in quarantine and that this would result in rabies becoming endemic in this country. The theory was that foxes were spreading the disease from Poland, gradually moving more and more west until they reached the English Channel. Once it reached Britain, it would soon mean that even our squirrels and bats would be carrying this deadly virus. There was hysterical talk of this being the greatest threat to the country since the end of the Second World War, and that we must all be prepared to do our bit. Sound familiar? In 1974, a new Rabies Act was introduced by the government to tackle this supposed danger, and rabies featured in various television series such as Doomwatch and The Survivors. Of course, nothing came of it all, and despite the fear-mongering of journalists and fierce speeches by politicians denouncing pet smugglers, rabies did not arrive in this country. The general atmosphere of alarm was not helped when 2 men died of rabies in London in 1975, even though they had contracted the disease abroad. It seems to me that every 20 years or so a health scare of this kind crops up, and some virus is cast in the role of the greatest threat faced by Britain since 1945. This is definitely what has happened with COVID, and just as with rabies and AIDS, historians of the future will probably smile at the ludicrous overreaction to that virus as well.